Edgar Cayce's JESHUA, ZERUBBABEL, EZRA and NEHEMIAH. Part 1 of 3. The following are a collection of Edgar Cayce readings in regards to the return of the Jews, or Israelites, in their effort to rebuild the walls and the temple, which was in a state of disrepair in the Holy City. We will start with those readings mentioning JESHUA, who was a past life of Jesus, and who was involved with the rebuilding of the walls and temples. If the entity will review the activities of Nehemiah, Ezra and JESHUA and Jezreel, much of these will become as an opening door to the consciousness of its abilities to direct, to hold, to maintain a unity where others have failed. First find thyself. Apply thyself in such a way and manner as to know what ye will do with this man, Jesus of Nazareth, Jeshua of Jerusalem, Joshua in Shiloh, Joseph in the court of Pharaoh, Melchizedek, as he blessed Abraham, Enoch as he warned the people, Adam as he listened to Eve. If the entity takes this as its study, and set this as its thought and then study the book which tells of him, Jesus born in Bethlehem of the Virgin Mary, know this is the same soul entity who reasoned with those who returned from captivity in those days when Nehemiah, Ezra, Zerubbabel were factors in the attempts of the re-establishing of the worship of God, and that JESHUA, the scribe, translated the rest of the books written up to that time. He came as JESHUA, the scribe, who compiled and rewrote the biblical record as we have it to that date. The entity saw those disputes that arose between the priests of one class and those under Ezra and Zerubbabel and JESHUA. When we consider his life and the promises of God regarding the manner of life, in man we find he fulfills all as is asked and required of man. As Adam, he knew not birth, but did know death, as Enoch he knew birth, but did not know death. As Melchizedek he knew neither birth nor death, as Joseph he knew all the pangs of life, a pattern of his life as the master. As Joshua, the leader, as JESHUA, the recorder of all as had been. As Jesus the life as sacrifice, for he knew himself to be himself, yet came to fulfill the law, thus becoming the law. The law then remains, those who live by the law, meet all they who live by faith in him are no longer under the law, save of grace. In the material world law, mental grace, spiritual wisdom. We would turn again to that realm of awareness in material experiences from which the entity may gather those lessons, those instructions, which arose from the activity of the entity called Joshua, that though in the earth's place or period of advancement, there may be the collective activity of that as would do good even unto those who persecute thee. The activity in such realms enables the entity to make that declaration, as made by Joshua, which has become a part of the awareness of each and every entity at times during the sojourns in the earth. Partaking of the earth, yet becoming less and less earthly minded. The expression was in that entity as he entered through those channels indicated as necessary for the functioning of the material, mental and spiritual mind, for the advent of that influence manifested in what ye call the Christ consciousness, the Christ awareness, JESHUA. For this, the Christ consciousness, is the basis. Downward he went to the depths of immersion in the consciousness of earth, backward he slowly began to climb. The Christ soul helped him. As Enoch, as Melchizedek, he took on flesh, to teach and lead. He was not born, he did not die, as these persons, and he realized that he could not show the way to mankind unless he made a pattern for them. He could not descend into their midst and teach them and expect them to follow, he had to suffer and think and experience earth as they did, and show them how to emerge from it. He was born as Joseph, again as Joshua, again as JESHUA, the scribe of Ezra who rewrote the Bible, and finally as Jesus. He showed the way. He became the way, he overcame death and the body, and returned to God, laying down the ego of the will, accepting the crucifixion. Please give the important reincarnations of Adam in the world's history. In the beginning as Emilius, as Adam, as Melchizedek, as Zend, as Asaph, as JESHUA, Joseph, Jesus. Then, as that coming into the world in the second coming. For he will come again and receive his own, who have prepared themselves through that belief in him and acting in that manner. For the Spirit is abroad, and the time draws near, and there will be the reckoning of those even as in the first so in the last, and the last shall be first. For there is that Spirit abroad, he standeth near. The entity was as an aid to Jeshua, as well as Ezra, in the interpreting of the law to the language of the peoples of that period. Please list the names of the incarnations of the Christ, and of Jesus, indicating where the development of the man Jesus began. First, in the beginning, of course, and then as Enoch, Melchizedek, in the perfection. Then in the earth of Joseph, Joshua, Jeshua, Jesus. The following Bible quotes and Edgar Cayce readings share some light regarding those who resisted the rebuilding efforts, which was led by Sanballat and his group. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. "What is this you are doing?" they asked. "Are you rebelling against the king?" I answered them by saying, "The God of heaven will give us success. We his servants will start rebuilding, but as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem, or any claim or historic right to it." In the days when the walls of the holy city were being rebuilded, the entity then in that of the one who led the forces against Sanballat, when he resisted the builders. Then in the name Aslan. In that period when the walls were being rebuilt in the holy city, the entity then among those who resisted those that builded, being in that of Sanbad, the armor-bearer to Sanballat, and the entity lost through this experience, for those that builded in a purpose. Those that resisted did so for the satisfaction of the self and for the power that might be given to self through that of destructive forces to man, and that the builders represented. Bringing to self destructive forces through aggrandizement of selfish interest. In that period when there were the wars in the land known as the Holy Land, during the period of the return of the children to the land for the re-establishing and rebuilding of the city, the entity was among those who grew up in the land, those that were not taken away, and the entity joining with those in the return was pulled many ways. For having been once a consort in Sanballat's group, not personally, the entity found much that brought consternation in the material affairs, yet hearkening most to those spiritual instincts and gaining something of the spirit of those who would rebuild, those who would bring again the horn of plenty in Israel, those that would establish again the altars of the living God, the entity became an extremist, pulled from one to the other. The entity was in the now called Persian or Phoenician lands, in those days or experiences, when there was the returning of those called the peoples of promise, or when the Jewish peoples were returning to Jerusalem. The entity was among those who were called the followers or associates of Sanballat, those who had been a part of the experience, but had become intermingled through the activities of Shallum, the first of the Persian kings that had carried a portion of these peoples captive, had brought the priest for direction and for protection. There we find the entity was of awe in that environment. The name then was Jephthah. In the days when the peoples came to rebuild the walls of the holy city, the entity then in that of the ruler who resisted their rebuilding same, and in the name then Ephidox, and the entity then retarded somewhat in the development, for the resistance, as was found, to the entity's displeasure, was that the resistance was against him who leads the right with the high, yet loving, hand. There were three main groups that returned at separate times. The first returning group was led by Zerubbabel. Then the second group with Ezra. The final group was led by Nehemiah. The following readings mentions those remained, or were never taken away from Israel. Included within this section are those that are unclear to us, which of the three groups they traveled back to Israel. The entity was in the promised land, during those periods of the return of the children of promise from the Chaldean land, and in the periods of the rebuilding of the temple. We find the entity was active in the redecorating, especially pertaining to the hangings of the temple that was rebuilded under Zerubbabel and Nehemiah and Ezra, and those in those experiences. The entity gained throughout that experience, as Jesuian. For the entity held close to those tenets and lessons of the law of old, that help meet to those who would serve in preserving not only the tenets of old, but as would create the purposes in the hearts and minds of those who would know their relationships to the creative forces or God. And the working in gold and in the metals made for those activities that bring those things into the experience of the entity, in the patterning of things that are made of such. These are beautiful, if they are ever kept constructive in the attitudes and purposes for which they are brought into being. The entity was in the land of promise, when there was the returning to the land from exile, in the rebuilding of the walls, in the rebuilding and re-establishing of the temple. The entity acted then in the capacity of a workman who aided in the redecorating of the temple and of the walls. Hence innately and manifestedly, we will find those abilities to choose in those directions, and in activities of such materially might great joy come to the entity in the present. Yet the bigger and greater work lies in the activity of supplying the manners, or such records that enable the many to apply themselves in such. Hence becoming an instructor, a director through the power of speech and writing, is the field of this entity, as it was in that experience as Eliab. The entity was in the promised land, during those activities of the return from the Persian, or the Chaldean land. There we find the entity was among those who were the builders in the city, making the closer associations, or arrangements with the workers, the laborers, as well as for the supply of materials. Hence those things pertaining to building of any nature, whether in cloths or furniture, or the recreations for activities of others, will become a part of the entity's experience. The name then was Eliab. The application of self then was under the direction of Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah, in which there were the needs for the activity in the material world coordinate and cooperative with the purposes in the spiritual atmosphere, the spiritual purposes. And so must these be applied in the activities in the present. The entity was in the Chaldean land, when there were the gatherings of those under the king to be returned to the land of promise. The entity's companion sought rather to remain, and yet under the supervision or counsel of the friends as related to Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah and the leaders in the return, the entity persuaded him to join with those who did return. And this brought to the entity some doubts as respecting those conditions, when turmoils arose with the neighbors in that land. Hence we find the entity then was being halted between two ways, yet in the application of self in those manners that made for the unifying of the purposes, even under the stresses of the occasions, the entity found peace and happiness. The name then was Usla. The entity was in the Holy Land, during those periods when there were the rebuildings, and the returning to the rebuilding of the temple and the walls of same. The entity was among those of the priestly tribe. A Levite, yet aided in all of the constructive activity about the temple service, as to its replenishing and rebuilding. Thus we find the abilities for the routine without becoming rote, as warned of. There are the abilities to combine the daily activities with the spiritual development. This is a virtue so few have attained, to make their religious experiences, their spirituality, practical in their daily lives. The name then was Joshebed, and the entity gained much. In the present there are those abilities for activities that deal with the creating or formation of ideas and ideals for others. In the return of the chosen forces to the holy city, and in the rebuilding of the walls in the city, and was the keeper at the east gate. In this the body has deterred and should use the will's forces in coming closer to the laws of the people. In the rebuilding of the walls in holy city when that people, of which this entity was a part, came from exile. In that of Elam who builded on the wall in the rebuilding of the holy city, when the entity then returned with the chosen people and builded on and over the south gate, then a defender and builder at the same time. We find in the rule when the rebuilding of the walls of the holy city were being brought, and the entity then the builder on the south gate, and the one sent to parley with Sanballat, who resisted the forces, as was being brought in by Nehemiah and Ezra. The entity then standing as the leader. In the days of the rebuilding of the walls from the first time the destruction brought to holy city. The entity then in that capacity of the scribe to the ruler. Then in the name Enli, and the entity developed much in that day, and through the law and the giving of same to many peoples, and especially to those of the household of that faith. In the holy city, among those who were left in the country, and was a caretaker of those coming to rebuild the city at that time. In that plain we find the entity in that of Nazar. In the days when the rebuilding of the walls of the holy city. The entity then in that one who assisted in the gathering of those necessary usages of temple service in that day. Then in the name Lidzia, and the entity then gave much of self in this holy service, and aided many in their understandings of physical, moral and spiritual laws, especially concerning the temple worship. In the rebuilding of the walls of the holy city. The entity then in that of the assistant to the one in charge of the rebuilding. Then in the name Nehemiah, and the entity then gained much in the rule, and in the development of self in the earth's plane, for the innate desire of religious forces, as has ever been manifest in the present plane, with that strict adherence to the laws of household, and to home, and peoples. In the days of the rebuilding of the walls in the holy city. The entity then in that of the herdsman that brought in the service cattle to the temple, or priest, in the first offering when the new, or the altar restored to new service. In the name Zebdiel. In that period of the return to the holy city. The entity among those that led in that return. In the name then Isbahel, and was a builder in the woodwork of the restoration of the temple. In the days when the walls of the holy city were being rebuilt. The entity then among those who were in the first temple worship, after its being cleansed and rebuilded. Then in the name Eliaska, and the entity gained through service in this position, yet when changes were made, and the house of Zadok were deposed, as it were, the entity made resentment to individuals, rather than carrying cause to the giver of all good and perfect gifts. In the days when the walls of the holy city being rebuilt. The entity then among those who labored on the walls of same. Then in the name Hosea, and the entity gave much then to the peoples in the manner of teaching and of keeping those precepts, as were set about as the tenets of the people in this rebuilding. The entity gained through that period in giving of self in body and in mind to others. In that period when the walls of the holy city were being rebuilt. The entity then among the children of Levi, and among those to return to the holy city. Then in the name Lelia, and the entity gained in the experience, especially in the giving and teaching of the precepts of the peoples and forefathers. In that when the walls of the city were being rebuilded, and the returns of the people from the land of exile. The entity then in that of the second priest to those peoples, as returned when there was the choosing of the Levite, the entity being then of that tribe, to the office of priestship in the temple. The entity then in the name Lendria, and was the priest for the period of rebuilding, and until the establishing of the government in safety. The entity gained through that period in its ability to serve others, with the giving of the law, and in the application of same in the lives who sought counsel and advice. In the rebuilding in the holy city. The entity then among those who restored the inner trappings and workings in the temple there. The entity then one well versed in the applied arts pertaining to wood and the use or application of same in building, and in the end the servant to those who waited in and near the holy place. Hence of the tribes of Levi. In the name then Ithiaod. In that period when the walls of the holy city were being rebuilt. The entity then among those who strove with the workers in the restoration of the temple service, and in the name Abinia. In that period when there was the rebuilding of the holy city. The entity then was among those who inclined toward the establishing of worship, and yet gave self in that manner that brought to self those of the bad, some persecutions, some without, then in the name eclat. In that period when there were being the walls of the city rebuilded. The entity then among those who builded, working on the east gate. The entity the soldier and the builder. Also the educator, or director in the law. Then in the name Ithaca, giving much understanding, defending many of those oppressed, assisting in the rebuilding and the re-establishing of the worship. In the rebuilding of the holy city. The entity then the laborer on the wall near the south gate, and a defender against those that would hinder the building. The entity then in the name Elim. In that period when there were the returning to the land of promise from captivity. During those of the second return from the Chaldean land, did the entity gain in the experiences of that travel, in the experiences of those conditions, as builded in the inner man that of the ideal. In the name, then Ejlael, did the entity aid in the giving of the peoples the proper concept of what it meant to the nations of the land about, as well as to that people called separate, and apart to establish his name there. In their return and in the replenishing and building up of the holy city did the entity gain. In the present experience, those of sacred music, those of sacred things to the spiritual worship, have a peculiar influence. In that land when the peoples returned to the holy city for the re-establishing of the walls thereof, that same might be protected by those influences, did the entity, in an aid to those of the incoming priests' rule bring an aid to the people, failing only in the desire of prestige in self's application at the altar, and so brings those forces as make for life itself in the material plane to move onward and upward, in its attempt to reach the sources of the energative forces themselves in this universal experience, which an entity, in material and physical forces, may attain for a holy, or whole of experience. In the name in this period, that of Jahel. In that period when there was the return of the children from the land of bondage in Persia, did the entity gain an insight from those peoples, who would return to build the holy city. The entity was among those who returned, and was a builder on the wall. Over the south gate did the entity labor the most, in the name then Zerubbabel. In this experience the entity gained throughout, for, from the beginning of the training for those officers of the services in the temples, the entity reasoned with, aided, Zerubbabel, as also Xerxes, in the releasing and gathering together of those earthly things that would enable the re-establishing of the worship in the holy city. The entity was in the land now called the Promised Land, when those peoples of promise returned for the rebuilding of the temple, for the replenishing of the city, and of the walls thereof. Hence in the experience of the entity we find those things that are of a sacred activity become as sacred to the entity. Yet these held as has been the experience of the entity in deference to those things, as were given in Galilee may become as Nehush tan to the peoples, or a stumbling block to those that would know the way. For as he hath given, not in this mountain, not in that temple, but the day will come when in the hearts and minds of men and women will the praise of the Lord and his might be proclaimed, rather than from any given city, time or place. The entity was in the Chaldean land, during those periods, when there were the preparations for the peoples called the Jewish, or Hebraic to return to their own land, for their establishing again of the activities in their homeland. The entity may be said to have been the counselor then to the king, Xerxes, that there might be not only the satisfying of the king's longings for knowledge, but that there might be tried out the experiment that those people might proclaim again, that which was a portion of their traditions during those experiences. For the entity then acted even as it may be found in the experience in the present, that it may help others to help themselves, where the activity of self would not be in that direction. The entity was in the land now known as the Promised Land, during those periods when there were those returnings for the rebuilding of the temple. And the entity was among those peoples that had been left in the land, when there were the activities in the exodus of the main body, or of that peoples. For the period covered years and years. Yet when there were those activities under the supervision of Zerubbabel, the priest, and Nehemiah and Ezra, the lawgiver and the priest and the active service, the entity persuaded many of her own peoples, that were called later the mixed races, or the peoples that were hated later by their own brethren, to become closer affiliated, closer associated with the spiritual activity in the lives of the individuals. Thus the entity builded in that experience not only in the material, but in the mental and the spiritual activities, in the name Shulmeen. The entity lived during those periods when there was the rebuilding in the temple from those activities under Nehemiah, Ezra, Zerubbabel, and the activities that had brought about the restoration to those peoples of the activities in that particular land. The entity was among those who were the leaders of the group in that of entertaining, and did much to make for the addition of the psalm singing and the music as pertained to the attempt to restore the activities of David in the bringing up of the ark, or what may be termed as the dance that made for the bringing of same to temple service, or temple activity. Sacred dance, not lewd but sacred, as well as the song. The entity was in the lands when there was the rebuilding of the walls in the holy city, with the return of the children of promise to the re-establishing of worship according to the dictates of their conscience. Hence we will find that liberty, freedom, and conditions in which people in position will be innately, as to the entity, those who should be in authority. Hence the necessity for those trainings and those directions of the entity in the formative years, in that each individual must stand according to that he has applied, and not according to class, nor heredity. In other words, there should be the instilling within the entity that merely being in power, or power alone, does not always make right. In that experience we find the entity's dealings were with the peoples roundabout, during the periods of the activities of Nehemiah and Ezra. These were questioned oft by those in authority within the walls, as well as by the king, and recalled by him. Yet as we find, the greater portion of the entity's development, during that sojourn, was in being able to meet the various groups and various activities upon their own grounds. Hence the necessity in the present for giving a reason, and for the answering of the why as to every question that may arise in the entity's experience through the formative mental development. The entity was also in the Holy Land, as known in the present, during those periods of the return of the peoples of promise. Though the entity was of those peoples that remained in the land, it became especially interested because of the activities which followed the intents and purposes of the edict issued by Ezra during those experiences. And as the entity showed itself to be equal to and sincere in its efforts for the establishing of ideals, it was among the very few chosen to become a part of the experience in the re-establishing of the temple and the spiritual worship of those peoples during that experience. The name then was Belenhi. Though among the Samaritans, as called, and of that people, the entity gave its service to those who made for the establishing and reiterating of the laws pertaining to the service and the activities in the temple, and the activities of the peoples in their replenishing and reactions in those experiences. The entity gained then throughout. In the present we find the ability to interpret, the ability, as a linguist being a part of the entity's experience, from those variabilities, as established during the retranslating of much of those things that were part of the experience. And if the entity will review the activities of Nehemiah, Ezra and JESHUA and Jezreel, much of these will become as an opening door to the consciousness of its abilities to direct, to hold, to maintain a unity where others have failed. Thus the entity will be enabled to give even the greater counsel to those just starting their relationships, as one with another, and with the efforts in fitting themselves into environs and activities, in which they have found and do find their experiences entirely different from their earlier periods of activity. The entity was in that land where there was the returning to the city of promise, the re-establishing of the temple activities in the promised land. The entity was among those who aided in enabling activities with those of other lands, as in Egypt, Persia, India, especially those activities along the sea of what is now Greece and Turkey and Rome. All of those were a part of the entity's experience during that particular sojourn, owning, as it were, what would be called in the present a fleet of ships, in the name then Asputula. In the experience the entity gained through the greater part, in the mental, the spiritual and the material things, as to abilities in directions pertaining to water and waterways, as to ships and shipbuilding, the manner and means of transportation, the choices of activities in the various lands. For the abilities in the present are such that the mediums of exchange, or the needs of those of various peoples, will become a part of the experience. In that experience the entity held close to the counsel that was a part of the experience of Ezra and Nehemiah. The entity was in the promised land, when there were those children of promise returning from bondage, or from the land where there were those scattered in the Persian land, to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the activities there. We find the entity acting in the capacity of what would be called today the architect, or one choosing materials, and guiding and directing in the manner of building. And from those experiences we find many interests become a part of the entity in the present. Then the name was Elisir. The entity was in the lands during those periods when there was the return from captivity into the promised land. There we find the entity was among the natives of that land during that experience, making overtures to the leaders of the returned groups as a means for the united efforts. And being repelled owing to the variations in their beliefs, this has brought a peculiar experience in the innate forces of the entity as to classes, as to people of certain group, or breed or peoples of certain strain, or those of certain beliefs having much to do, or to influence those peoples in their activity in various forms. The name then was Elba. The entity was in the Chaldean land, during those experiences, when there were the activities, which made Xerxes relent, owing to the experiences of those who brought to the knowledge of the king the abilities of the promised land to supply tribute from a peoples who loved liberty, to the needs of that land. The entity was among the king's own guard, that were part of the experience of those who journeyed back to the lands. Thus we find the entity acting in the capacity of advisor to not only those of other thoughts than the entity's own, in the religious, or in the thoughts of worship, but as to the truths that were the motivative forces in the mental experiences of the men of that day. The name then was Glendur. The entity was active in those periods of the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. The entity was among those associated with the activities of the temple and the furnishings of same, for the entity was very close to those activities of the scribes as well as the priests. Thus we find that innate desire for close associations with worship activities, and these cause in the experience of the entity of the awakenings to the voice especially of Nehemiah or Ezra, or those of that period, if interpreted or read in the presence of the entity. The entity was not a priest, but as one who waited upon and who counseled with those who made for better conditions in those offices. These were the activities of the entity then, as JESHUA. In the experience the entity gained throughout, and there are those experiences in the present from same, that when the entity finds itself in extremes, and turns to the belief, the activity that proclaims the belief in the divine influence, greater are the material as well as mental satisfactions arising in the experience of the entity. The entity was in the Persian land to which the peoples of the promised land had been banished, but during those periods when there was the arousing of the kings, of those in authority, to give freedom to the peoples of the various faiths under the dictates of their own beliefs and tenets. There the entity was a companion to the first of the kings, under those giving the dispensation to such. Thus the cry which has ever been, that is innate within the experience of the entity, for freedom of speech, freedom to worship according to the dictates of the own consciousness, each in his own sphere of activity giving allegiance to the one hope in the oneness of man's faith in God. The name then was Vastion. In the present the influences from that sojourn oft bring disturbances, because of the promptings of those who are teachers here or there. Thus there are the needs that the entity hold to that embracing influence as found in him alone, abide in me, and I in thee, thus may the glory of God be made manifest in the earth. The entity was active in the earth during the return of the peoples from captivity, and the rebuilding of the holy city and the walls thereof. There the entity was among those who aided in the work of the redecoration in metals, in brass, in the activities about the holy places. The entity was not happy in mind, nor in its physical surroundings, yet brought much to many peoples during that sojourn, that activity. And much that arises in the present experience of the entity comes from those things experienced there, in the holy city, and in the service rendered. Hold fast to those things that ye tempered there, and brought into the activities of many through that sojourn, as JESHUA. The entity was in the promised land, when there were those edicts given by the Persian kings for the return of those children of promise, that they might themselves establish their own worship according to their own ideals. The entity was an armor-bearer to the king, and eventually was sent as one to assist in seeing that those edicts were carried out, and that protection was given to those who labored in a cause. Thus the entity came into the promised land with Nehemiah, with Ezra, Zerubbabel, and those who labored in those periods of activity. From there the entity reported back and forth. There the entity kept the activities in such measures that from one king to another there were the various edicts given that aided those peoples to again establish a place of worship. The entity was in the Persian or Babylonian land, when there had arisen the desires upon the part of Cyrus that there be given the opportunity for the varied groups over which he had become the power and might, to manifest in their own ways and manners, that it might be to the good of all. The entity then was the queen, Amazmum. In the experience the entity gained greatly by its aid and help to those who were allowed, under the edicts as directed by the king, to return to the promised land and there to rebuild the worship which to them had become, then, merely a thing of which they had heard. Thus the entity was in close association with Zerubbabel and those of his household, Nehemiah, who was a favorite of the entity during his service at the court, and who has been a part of the experiences of this entity in associations, through activities in the earth more than in that experience alone. The entity bore a helpful influence toward the educating of those who were to interpret the law, and to make same accessible. The entity was in the promised land, when there was the returning, the rebuilding of the activities in the holy city, the rebuilding of the temple as well as the rebuilding of the walls. Hence the acquaintanceships with those in authority, as Nehemiah, Ezra, Zerubbabel, all of those in authority in the various phases, were portions of the entity's experience, and the entity acted as a guard on the wall. Also the entity was acquainted with those outside the wall, and questions arose. Yet the entity, after the associations with those close in the temple, became one to whom authority was entrusted, and thus brought greater development, materially, mentally and spiritually for the entity. The name then was Jesubdan. In the present from same no, while it may be well to be acquainted with the shady sides, truth and spirit must be the promptings of the material, the moral and the social relationships with things, conditions and peoples. The entity was in the Persian land, when there were those changes being wrought in the status of the peoples who in their teachings were at variance to the Medes and Persians, when Cyrus issued the edicts. The entity was not of the kingly place, but, as might be said today, was acquainted with those of the same social sect or set, though not of the king's family nor of his warriors, but of his friends or counselors who were in political influence or power, as would be termed today. Then in the name Cleoporinjda, the entity gained, the entity heard, the entity inquired. And the leaders, as Nehemiah, as Ezra, became acquaintances of the entity. And the eventual visit of the entity to Jerusalem aroused the entity to activities through that experience. Things then Oriental, things Egyptian, things that deal with the delving into the mysteries of the past, or the manners in which those in the position as students apply themselves in making a record of the happenings in such a manner as in symbols, in signs, in all phases of writings, are plainly written evidence. Yet only those capable of interpreting same learn the full meaning. These are of interest to the entity. Thus the entity is a good questioner, as well as a good conversationalist. The entity was in the Persian land in those experiences, when there were the preparations for the return of a peoples to build a city to their God. What, who, where is thy God? Just as ye experienced, as ye saw as the daughter of Cyrus, who issued the decree to bring about those changes in the lands. These were disturbing for ye knew not how to apply. Yet they answered to something within thy activities then, in the name Perseus. It may be said that the entity gained, for there was the attempt to apply the teachings of those individuals. 4. The entity then was very much in love with the cupbearer to the king, Nehemiah. And yet kept separate, kept aloof because of the religious, as well as social conditions in the experience. Remember, true love knows not barriers of any kind that are only of man's creation. For man is the co-creator with the builder and the maker of the universe, and yet creates conditions, positions, thoughts, that often turn and rend his own self. These were builded through the experience because of social positions, but the entity gained. For it learned a lesson of patience, as well as the abilities to sing and to play, if it would, and to dance well. All of these have their place in the experience, but use them to the glory of God the more often, rather than for the mere satisfaction of the social or body emotions. The entity was in the land when there were those returnings from the bondage of the children of promise from the Persian land. The entity was among those who aided in rebuilding the walls. The entity was acquainted with the disputation between Hezekiah, Ezra, Zerubbabel and Jeshua. These cause within the present experience any dislike where there are wrangles in the home, or especially in those which would be called churches. These the entity holds as the deeper reasons why there should be or should not be special stress laid upon such things. And yet these must be found latent and deep within the entity. The name then was Ebezen. The entity was in the Holy Land during those periods when the peoples were returning from bondage in the Chaldean land. The entity was among the very small children, born in the Chaldean land, but entering into activity in the city, when there had been again the re-establishing of the temple, as well as the walls thereof. While disputations arose between those in authority, as of Zerubbabel, Jeshua, Ezra and Nehemiah, the entity gained much from all of these, for it used the experiences of each in their zealousness, or in their attempt to embrace all to apply in rectifying disturbances that arose. Thus the entity came to be among those that were helpers to those set in authority through the activities in the re-establishing of the service there. These brought hope, help, peace, as they may in the present, in returning to those directions of the law of divine origin, the unchangeable laws in hope, peace, brotherly love, grace, mercy, patience, kindness. Against such there is no law, for they are the law. And as ye embrace or apply these ye become the law, in such. The name then was Estrella. The entity was in the Promised Land, during those periods when there was the returning of those groups of individuals to establish, or to carry out the edict of Artaxerxes in the Holy Land. The entity was among those of the Persian or Chaldean land, who became imbued with that causing the individual ruler, not an adherent of that faith, to issue such edicts, whether to be popular with the subjects, and in following Cyrus' edicts, or whether motivated by the seeking of those in authority as priests and scribes in the city of the king, when there were those requests for the prayers of the children of the king. In the activities the entity saw those disputes that arose between the priests of one class and those under Ezra and Zerubbabel and Jeshua. Hence in the present we find those questionings as to ritualistic activities of any particular faith, yet the entity in its contribution to the welfare of the peoples in that period united much of the efforts, not only of those who had been left in the Holy Land, but those disputations that arose because of the mixing of the races, or of the peoples of the land with the children of those returned from captivity. The name then was Adonched.